One of the ironies of human life when you get my age, which admittedly doesn't mean as much as it did in traditional society, since it's a little bit easier to make it into your mid 40s because it's a little bit easier to survive your childhood. Um, but if you get my age, you start seeing a certain amount of repetition in these movements and the same kinds of habits, and you start seeing patterns. And one of the interesting patterns that you see is that people kind of bifurcate in face of large systemic adversity that they can't control. They will double down on their way of life, become more conservative in the small c sense of that term, and try to do the things more the same way as they've done it in the past. Many people will also embrace some flexibility, um, try to adapt to the situation, including radically changing their lifestyles, even if their lifestyle change will not actually completely affect the situation. Sometimes, uh, such things as moving from single use plastics in your home is, a way to feel like you're doing something in the same way that sympathetic magic is a way to feel like you're doing something. It does actually do something if everyone adopted it, but there's a reason everyone doesn't. And that reason is an infrastructure that makes such inconvenience actually have a price and premium, and that is set up for you, which means that such morality becomes a price luxury good, or at least a price luxury experience. And a lot of the responses to this are tend to be failures of the imagination. You hit the problem with the immediate end of trying to just do it all voluntaristically as an individual to morally resort your life in small scale production, realizing how little effect it has on the larger systemic productive systems, the modes of production and consumption of which you are inherently plugged into. But then the response to that tends to be to turn to the most obvious form of management that most people see in their life, which is a nation state. And they turn to the nation state because the nation state has both an idea of internal legitimacy and external legitimacy. Like, you are a nation, and the nation is synthetic. It's based on an imagined community. Those imagined communities in Europe tended to be based on language. In the Middle East, they tended to be based on sectarian formations. In the colonized world, they tended to be based on whatever was fucking around that can maintain an army against the colonizer. And confession, religion, etc., often don't do it, and some of the lines are essentially arbitrary. But once they exist, they exist. There's a certain lapsarian argument you see right now where you think you can undo this historical development as an act of will. You can get rid of the settlers, you can undo the colonizing without it being massive amounts of ethnic cleansing everywhere on the planet. You can rely on nations and national policy in a moment where you're also talking about multipolarity. It is not actually clear to me why so many people who are invested in state or legal theory of money are also invested in multipolarity, except that they think a new unipolarity will emerge from the multipolarity, and it will be one that they would be more conducive to their planning technology. They want to deny this as imperialism and hide this under phrase works like spectrums of sovereignty without telling you what the spectrum of sovereignty actually requires, which is the command over labor and power. So, at the very moment when climate change means international cooperation is more necessary, and that capital is the most internationalized that it's been in a long time, we see this in the fact that even though there's been attempts at decoupling, and there has been a grand deal of decoupling between the United States and China, it hurt both parties. And people in the left only wanted to see the parts of it that made them feel good. People on the right are the same. This tendency to only want your own position confirmed is a normal tendency, but it's a sign of your inability to be adaptive. And in the current moment, it's a sign that you are probably going to lose. But this sense of apocalypticism does make people feel good because they see through it. The truth is unveiled. And in some ways, it really is. The truth is unveiled. But we drop down on national solutions. Now, some national solutions are perfectly rational. Single payer healthcare is a perfectly rational response that most of the world adopted, even in the capitalist world, because there is no way to make healthcare function like a rational market. Now, the idea of rational market itself is actually kind of a paradox because, as I said in the last video, the incentives streams for most businesses don't actually flow that way anyway. But in medicine, it's always true that it's the case. Um, the cost to benefit is too high, which is why healthcare grifts are probably the easiest grifts to pull off because people are often desperate. Information asymmetry abounds. But when you look at things like we're fighting for national sovereignties and relations to the land, and a static view of land where people can pretend that these claims to land go back, thousands of years, that does fit an indigeneity discourse that is worth taking somewhat seriously. But the great movements of peoples are very real, and you aren't going to stop it, particularly during climate change. So many of these things that you're adopting right now, at the moment where one of your frameworks is saying, hey, there's going to be all kinds of movements of people, and another work of your framework is saying, well, we have to go back to our traditional lands to undo the damage done by settlerism and capitalism, as if settlerism was an inherent to capitalism and feudalism and many other forms of human organization. Your answer is to go back to a prior form that led you here. That was the point of some of my last videos. Since we're not looking at social reproduction, we're not looking at production, we're not looking at animals and ecology, we look at them all separately, but they are all interrelated. You can't separate them out actually when you go to deal with policy. No, there's some basic underlying assumptions here. So a lot of people don't want to deal with this and they just want to make the contradictions go away. Make it about moral belief sets, making it about convincing others. You see this whenever somebody wants to spam your wall with a bunch of links that support their worldview, as if that's going to get you to support it. Often the links are fine, but those links are selective and leave things out, and that's why people don't listen because they know that everyone is operating under selection bias. But that hasn't led to increased critical thinking. That has led to totally shutting down and just going with your gut. One of the things about skepticism universalized to that point is it doesn't lead to critical thinking. It doesn't lead to discernment, your ability to make judgments about value. What it leads to is a refusal to judge and doubling down on your own emotions. So, at this moment where it seems like the nation state is going to have the hardest time dealing with international problems, is the very moment when many of us want to go back to the nation state as a collective actor and imaginary. And even if we say we oppose nationalism and talk about fascism all the time, if all of our solutions are nationally managed solutions, which only deal with individual polities at the national level because they have currency sovereignty or whatever, then you don't really have an answer to your problem. In fact, what you're doing is sticking your head in the ground too. And in some ways, it's more damaging because you're claiming that you're not doing that. Now, all this can lead someone to nihilism and despair, which is, not particularly useful. And it can lead you to go do the thing where someone finds every stupid debate that college students have on campus, which, yes, they really are dumb, but you don't expect 19-year-olds from a relatively infantilized society that are flooded with information to necessarily have the most discerning judgment on everything. If we've based our entire response off reaction to the dumbest arguments that exist out there, often presented dishonestly anyway, we can find ourselves in a world of just reacting to media spectacle. And a lot of leftists end up making a career out of this in the media by doing so. You can talk about TikTok bin Laden all day. How big is that? It's hard to know because all these matrices and stuff are very hard to see how many people are just exposed to it and how many people sincerely engage with it, since TikTok is passively consumed anyway. Now, these things won't seem directly related and not directly to my title, Beyond the Black Pill, but that's what I'm actually trying to get you to do. Not to get you to resign and give up on human agency, but to realize what the limits are and to be just as critical of yourself as you are others. To ask yourself, what parts of this am I telling myself that's causing me not to see the bigger picture? And is that leading me to double down on something at the very moment when I shouldn't be? Now, there's another way to respond to this. The response, if you can build an ideology that you can't critique unless you accept the ideology. I see this with many mystical and right wing points of view, but left wingers do it too. You see it in things like standpoint epistemology, right? The standpoint privileges, the qualia of the oppressed people, which only they know, which as qualia is true. For those of you who don't know qualia, the quality of experience. Oppressed people know their experience. Now, are they always telling you the truth about it? No, but they do know it better than you can. But that does not necessarily give them any insight into the structure of oppression any more than being the oppressor does. And that assumption of the qualia was kind of wrongly deduced from readings of Marxism anyway. Ironically, even though this is a very liberal associated point of view, it does come out of people trying to apply Lukács to other standpoints. And there is a sense in which, like, weak standpoint epistemology is true, in that we all have perspectives, and our perspectives are informed by our prior positionality in larger societies, and that some people are going to have truths that others aren't going to have because of that positionality. Okay, sure. But that's not usually what the claim is. Their claim is, like someone has unique knowledge of oppression because of their status and their life experience, etc. That's not always helpful. And that doesn't get you out of the problem of the black pill or doubling down on things that don't work. And in fact, if anything, it makes it worse because your identity is based off your oppression. If your identity is so important to you at that point, what's your incentive to give it up? This is often pointed about quote identity politics unquote, but it's also true of workerism. If you valorize the worker to the point that working is seen as its own good and the proletarian status is seen as a good in and of itself, what's the point of giving it up? Why not just stay a better treated worker? Now, in Marxism, the point was always like, well, they're the universal subject who bring an abolition to this class relation because it brings an abolition to our formal class relations, right? That's the Marxist hypothesis in a way. But so far, that hasn't happened. And most mediations to Marxism are actually giving up parts of its current form. So you say, "Oh, the revolutions was led by peasants, and so Marxists were wrong." And then you say, "But they didn't overtranscend capitalism. Even the communists actually exist in socialist societies, even if you think they run differently and with a different orientation. They all exist in an international capitalist framework, trade as capitalists, and the markets at least at the firm level, if not at the individual level, and many of whom have less social services than even capitalist states do. After all, China just adopted Singapore's housing policy to kind of deal with some of its problems of privatizing its housing in the 1990s, which made some people very wealthy. And that their way of privatizing it was very progressive. They gave it to the people who lived in it, unlike unlike what the post-Soviets did, which is give it to a mixture of whoever had capital and uh, youth communist groups who were allowed to run co-ops, which were easily bought out by people with more sketchy forms of capital, or state fiat given to formal lords are through conquest, i.e., the settler colonial states. Right. This is not the time to be limiting yourself to these paradigms of the past, and yet it's the time where I see it more than ever. The time where chartalism seems to actually be the least explanatory for how to deal with things, even though it's true. We finally see its truth that the government can't run out of money. I mean, duh. Um, And inflation is more complicated than most people realize. Also, duh. No one theory of it seems to explain all of it, by the way, because it's a complex phenomenon. Economics doesn't like complex phenomenons because it likes to operate on their Occam's razor. But one of the things that I point out, the paradox of Occam's razor, is theories that were created by Occam's razor end up becoming more and more complex over time, necessarily to stay true. Sometimes they collapse under their own weight and their whole theoretical paradigm fails because they're too complex. But there's no reason to assume that truth and parsimony are actually related. So you got to get beyond these simple ways of thinking. You want to look at the way monetary theory works, you have to look at imperialism. But if you want to look at imperialism, you have to give up the idea that every state can just do it without taking on imperialist like qualities or forming cooperatives between states that overcome those imperialist like qualities. But the latter thing, which I think what a lot of more progressive international MMTers want, uh, often doesn't happen because there's competition between firms and states for resources. This also gives us the problems like, dealing with renewable energy for climate change. There's enough rare minerals probably to start building up a large infrastructure. Now it's going to take a lot of ecological damage to build up that infrastructure. It's going to take a lot of mining. Probably wouldn't add to climate change. It's going to cause other ecological problems because things always do. But let's say you got those up, you rebuilt your grid. The problem is those minerals are not evenly distributed, and we live in a world of nations and markets. And until you deal with those nations and markets, you're kind of in trouble. I mean, one of the things that we're talking about nations in the Levant, and I don't say this to you know push back on people, but I do wonder how much of the Levant's going to be inhabitable in a generation by anybody, and what is it going to mean? You know, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be fighting for a free Palestine, but is Palestine viable afterwards? What does that mean for us? What does it mean that a lot of what we've all done collectively, and some states and capitalists more than others, uh, are going to mean that a lot of these things are going to shift again? Now, they've shifted before, right? But contestings over lands are coming. Contestings over more material resources are coming. We all know they're coming. We felt it for a long time. That's part of multipolarity, right? And there's no singular power axis that's going to be able to dominate it all. But some power axes, the larger states, and they all are larger states geographically, have an advantage in this. The reason why you talk about the largest states is kind of obvious, isn't it? Like, there's a reason why you talk about the United States, Europe as a whole, um, China, Russia to a lesser degree, India to a lesser degree. Also, as I've said, these don't meet nation state paradigms exactly. They are nations, and that there's a synthetic identity that holds them together, but they're not based on much. And there's internal conflict throughout all of them. The racial definition of the United States as a kind of othering thing of the otherwise universal claim to experience is clearly fracturing it, and should. But what are you going to do? This is not the only nation for which that is true for. We have to get beyond the black pill, but we also have to get beyond doubling down on what we know. We have to admit we don't know a lot of the answers to a lot of this, and we have to start forming them. And I get a lot of pushback on being relatively pro-nuclear, for example. I'm actually not. I mean, that's the funny thing. I don't actually think it's a long-term solution at all. I'm just sort of grasping at straws of what the immediate-term solution is, where you're getting all those intervals out of the air from people like, "Oh, we can do it quickly," and I just don't believe that. I've seen one report by the International Energy Agency that seems to think it's possible, but it gets reported from possible to like it's easy and likely, and that is not true. If it was true, nations that have made pledges would do it, as opposed to going back to carbon production, which is what most of them have ended up doing. Marx used to mock utopian socialists because they didn't make the sacrifices clear. You know, that even if arrange democratically, there'd probably be some small scale civil wars at minimum. That this would be bloody and violent, etc. Now, a lot of this stuff hasn't come to be anyway, nor have the stakes of those kind of conflicts can be easily just stated in the same way now. I mean, it's one thing to argue about a civil war in the 19th century; it's another to argue about it in the age of drones. But a lot of stuff is coming. We might even see things like warlordism come back in a lot of these areas. You might see your local chamber of commerce become, petite bourgeois lords. Who knows? None of this is inevitable, though. The only thing that's inevitable is if you ignore the past and only look at the things that you want to see. That dooms you to be blindsided. Everything involves a trade-off. We need to start being more realistic like that. If you want to build hope on something real, that's where you start. I know this has been kind of rambly, because there's a lot of complicated ideas I'm weaving together here. But to get beyond the black pill, one has to necessarily be pessimistic about what you're told in the present and not selectively so, and critical, but not selectively so. One has to have discernment as critical thinking, not just doubt. One needs ethics, right? But one must realize that one's ethics is not going to be enough to get everything done. One needs to look at the way states and municipalities and stuff have handled these things in the past, but be honest about the limitations upcoming when you need more international cooperation and realizing that the ecologies don't give a shit about our political boundaries. These are things we have to accept. Now, this is the last in this series for now. I hope that your new year finds you well. And maybe if we all grow up a little bit, we could start building something beyond being stuck in these cycles of reaction and pretending that our politics as we believe it is a politics manifested in the world. Because it's not. Belief requires action to be made real. And some beliefs can't be acted on and thus can't really be made real. And on that note, like and subscribe.